The laughter at my sister's wedding wasn't meant to celebrate. It was meant to sting. I stood at the edge of the reception, the clinking of champagne glasses and the endless chatter surrounding me, yet somehow I wasn't really there. I could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck, as if every smile and every whisper was at my expense. My name is Admiral Rhonda, and that night I was reminded that sometimes the cruelest wounds don't come from enemies on the battlefield. They come from family who choose not to see you at all. My sister glowed in her white dress, beaming as though the universe had bent itself in her favor. She floated around the room like she owned the air everyone breathed, and the relatives followed her like moths to a flame. Every word spoken to her was dipped in honey. "You've done so well. We're so proud. Look at the life you've built." Meanwhile, I stood by the wall, the forgotten shadow, sipping at a glass of water while their praise filled the room. It was the father-in-law who struck first. He was the kind of man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, the kind of man who puffed up his chest to fill every space with his importance. He looked at me, smirked, and with his champagne glass raised, said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, "And who is this?" Just another guest, I suppose. Probably doesn't even have a real job. His words hung in the air like poison. The laughter that followed was worse than the words themselves. It wasn't just one person. It was a ripple of amusement that spread across the table, fueled by people who had no idea who I was or what I had done. My family didn't defend me, not a single word of correction, not a single gesture of acknowledgement. They laughed with him, as though they agreed, as though his insult was the truth. I swallowed hard, my pride burning as memories clawed their way to the surface. I remembered my graduation from the academy, empty chairs where my family should have sat. I remembered promotion ceremonies where my name was called with honor, medals pinned to my chest, and how afterward I'd checked my phone for messages from home, only to find none. I remembered holidays where I came back with stories of service, only to be silenced, told to let your sister talk, her job is harder than yours. I stood there in that room, my uniform unseen, my sacrifices unrecognized, and all I could feel was the suffocating weight of invisibility. How could I have fought storms, commanded ships, led men and women into danger, and still be reduced to nothing in the eyes of my own blood? I didn't argue back. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I stood quietly, letting them believe their version of me while inside, I held the truth of who I really was. But the sting of that laughter dug deep, reminding me once again that no matter how high I rose, at this table, I would always be their afterthought. And yet, even in that, silence. I knew something they didn't, that the moment would come when the truth would break through their ignorance. It wasn't here yet, but it was coming. And when it did, no amount of laughter would ever erase it. The truth is, the hardest battles I ever fought weren't on foreign seas or in the heat of combat. They were the ones I fought alone in silence. My name is Admiral Rhonda, but to my family, that title has always been invisible. They never asked about the nights I went without sleep, the storms I faced on open waters, or the decisions I made that weighed heavier than anything they could imagine. To them, my life has always been a blank page, a story not worth reading. I remember the academy as if it were yesterday. I wasn't the strongest, not at first. I wasn't the fastest, but I had something the others didn't, a determination that refused to die. When they told me I wasn't cut out for leadership, I stayed up nights studying until my eyes burned. When they said I wasn't tough enough, I ran until my legs gave out. Then I ran more. I was underestimated from the start, and maybe that's why I fought so hard, to prove that I could not only stand among the best, but lead them. But those victories, those milestones, meant nothing in my own home. The first time I wore my uniform in front of my parents, I expected pride, maybe even admiration. Instead, my mother said, "It looks nice, but when are you going to get a real job?" I laughed then, trying to brush it off, but inside, it carved a wound, and that wound never healed. When I was commissioned, when the flag was raised and my oath was spoken, I looked out at the crowd for familiar faces, the rows of proud families holding flowers, clapping with tears in their eyes. It was beautiful, but it wasn't mine. My family didn't come. Not then, not ever. They had excuses, always excuses, but the truth was simple. They didn't care. Each medal I earned, each mission I completed, I wore them with honor. But at the dinner table, those medals were invisible. They never asked about the people I led, about the nights I spent calming fear in the eyes of young sailors who looked to me for guidance. They never asked what it felt like to make choices that meant life or death. Instead, they asked about my sister's promotions at her office job, clapped for her stories of small victories while I sat in silence, carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken battles. It hurt more than any wound I ever received in service. Because betrayal from strangers you can endure. You expect it, you prepare for it. But betrayal from family is a cut that goes straight to the bone. And the cruelest part? They didn't even know they were doing it. To them, I was always just Rhonda, the difficult daughter, the one who didn't follow the same path, the one they couldn't brag about in casual conversation. But as I sat at that wedding table, mocked and dismissed, I felt something shift inside me. I realized my silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. I didn't need to argue for my worth. I didn't need to beg for their recognition. My silence held power, because while they lived in ignorance, I lived in truth. And one day soon, that truth would no longer be silent. The laughter was loud, sharp, and cruel. The clinking of glasses filled the air as the father-in-law raised his champagne, his smug grin stretching across his face. "Here's to real success," he said, his words dripping with mockery. His eyes flicked toward me like a blade. Unlike some people who just sit back and live off government paychecks. The room erupted in laughter again, the kind of laughter that makes your skin crawl. It wasn't playful. It was pointed. It was meant to cut. I sat still, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, the humiliation pressing down on me like a weight. My years of service, my sacrifices, the blood and sweat I had given, all reduced to a cheap joke in front of relatives and strangers. I wanted to stand, to shout, to tell them who I really was. But something inside me held back, a quiet patience, an instinct that told me my moment was coming. And then it happened. The double doors at the far end of the hall opened. Heads turned. The laughter quieted slightly, curiosity rippling through the crowd. A man walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform jacket heavy with ribbons and medals even in retirement, a decorated admiral. I recognized him instantly, though we had never met personally. His reputation preceded him. He was one of the most respected names in the Navy, a man whose word carried weight everywhere he went. The father-in-law's grin widened as he spotted him, clearly proud to boast of the groom's family's connection. He straightened in his chair, ready to impress, ready to attach himself to borrowed prestige. "Ah, now this," he said loudly, gesturing toward the door, "is a man worth admiring." His voice dripped with satisfaction as if to underline my supposed inadequacy. But then the Admiral's eyes swept the room. His gaze was sharp, assessing until it landed on me. For a moment, his entire expression froze. His eyes widened, his mouth parted ever so slightly, and then he moved forward with purposeful steps. The room hushed as he crossed the floor. Every footfall seemed to echo in the silence that fell like a curtain. He stopped right in front of me. His posture was rigid, his tone sharp and filled with respect as his voice carried across the hall. "Admiral Rhonda, ma'am." The father-in-law's smirk collapsed like glass shattering. Guests turned their heads in disbelief, whispers breaking out like sparks. All the laughter, all the mockery, it drained from the room in an instant, leaving behind a silence so thick you could hear the sound of someone's breath catch. The decorated admiral stood there, saluting me with crisp precision. The respect in his eyes was undeniable, the kind that cannot be faked, the kind that comes only from knowing the weight of what another has endured and achieved. And in that moment, every lie, every dismissal, every joke told at my expense was obliterated. The truth had finally surfaced, and there was no taking it back. The retired admiral's voice carried across the room with the kind of weight that silenced every whisper, every breath. "You all may not realize who you're sitting with tonight," he began, his gaze steady on me, but his words meant for everyone. "Admiral Rhonda is not just another officer. She is one of the finest leaders I've ever known of in my decades of service. Her name is spoken with respect in halls where most of you will never set foot." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward me, toward him, and back again. The father-in-law who had mocked me sat frozen, his smugness draining from his face until all that was left was a pale stiffness. The admiral didn't stop there. He began to recount stories. Not gossip, not exaggerations, but real moments of history where my name was carved into the record. Missions where lives were saved because of decisive orders I gave. Honors awarded for operations most civilians could never even begin to comprehend. "Men followed her into storms where death seemed certain," he said firmly, "and they walked out alive because of her." His words were not embellished. They were facts, the kind of truth that burns brighter than any lie. I sat there quietly listening, my hands folded in my lap. I did not need to add anything to defend myself or to prove what I had already lived. Every medal I had earned, every long night in the field, every sacrifice that had gone unseen at home. It all stood visible now, laid bare in front of those who had dismissed me for years. My sister, the golden child in their eyes, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The pride she had worn like a crown at the wedding now seemed flimsy, fragile, as though it could not stand under the weight of truth. My parents avoided my gaze, their expressions tight with shame, their earlier smiles nowhere to be found. The father-in-law, the man who had thought himself clever at my expense, looked smaller with each passing word, his complexion ashen. The admiral's voice softened at last, but it carried no less weight. "She doesn't need my praise. She doesn't need anyone's. Her career, her rank, her sacrifices, they speak louder than anything I could ever say, and they will outlast any laugh or insult thrown her way." I gave a small nod, a gesture of acknowledgement. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk or revel in the reversal of power. My silence was deliberate, my calm steady. Because in moments like this, silence carried more force than shouting ever could. The room was suffocating in its quiet. The truth hung there, undeniable, like a heavy curtain no one could tear down. For once they could not twist the story, could not diminish me with their laughter. For once they had no choice but to see me, fully, undeniably, for who I truly was. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape of wood against the floor, loud in the silent room. Every eye followed me, but I did not rush. I stood with calm, with the same discipline that had carried me through storms far harsher than this one. I adjusted the sleeve of my jacket, smoothed the fabric, and lifted my chin. Not once did I look at the father-in-law, not once at my parents, not once at my sister who now sat shrinking into her own shadow. I did not need to. They already knew. I walked out of that hall without a single word of defense, because the truth had already spoken louder than I ever could. My revenge was not in shouting, not in throwing their cruelty back at them. My revenge was in the silence they were forced to sit with, the memory of their laughter turning into shame the moment the truth arrived at the table. As I stepped into the night air, a cool breeze brushed against my face. I closed my eyes and let it settle me. For years, I had wondered if I would ever be seen by my family, if the sacrifices I made, the lives I carried, the rank I earned, would ever mean anything in their narrow little world. Tonight I had my answer. It never mattered what they thought. They could snub me, they could mock me, they could try to reduce me to nothing in front of strangers, but their words were powerless against the life I had built. Their judgment was small, their world was small, and I had outgrown it long ago. Inside that hall, they would remain haunted by the way the truth exposed them. They would remember the retired admiral's words, his awe, his respect. They would remember how the father-in-law's smugness drained from his face, how my sister's pride cracked under the weight of reality, how my parents' silence was thick with shame. They would remember that in the very moment they thought they were making me small, the world outside revealed just how large I truly was, and I would not remember them at all. I walked away not as the forgotten daughter, not as the unwanted sister, not as the subject of their cruel jokes. I walked away as Admiral Rhonda, a woman who had faced storms and risen, a woman whose name carried weight in rooms they would never be invited into, a woman who did not need their approval, their pride, or their recognition. My worth was never theirs to define. It was always mine. And as I disappeared into the night, leaving their stunned silence behind me, I carried that truth with me like armor, untouchable, unshakable, free.